I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. And today we'll have two instead of one guest in our session, a father and son with whom we'll talk about how the concept of organizational culture within and outside the business context has evolved, and how being humble as a leader makes all the difference, both in general and specifically during times of change. I am very excited and humbled to have Edgar and Peter Schein with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit. Ed is Professor Emeritus of Massachusetts Institution of Technology, MIT Sloan of Management, a whole mouthful. He was educated at the University of Chicago, Stanford University, and Harvard University, where he received his PhD in social psychology. He's one of the most renowned theorists working with organizational culture. Edgar is most well known for his groundbreaking work on the organizational culture model. During his career, Edgar has investigated organizational culture, process consultation, research process, career dynamics, and organization learning and change. Ed has been a prolific researcher, writer, teacher, and consultant. Besides his numerous articles in professional journals, he has authored many books, including Organizational Psychology, Career Dynamics, Organizational Culture and Leadership, Process Consultation Volumes 1 and 2, Process Consultation Revised. Very important, the Corporate Culture Survival Guide, and we'll talk more about that today, Humble Inquiry, and Humble Leadership. Peter Schein is a strategy consultant in Silicon Valley. He provides help to startups and expansion phase technology companies. Peter's expertise draws on over 20 years of industry experience in marketing and corporate development at technology pioneers. Through his experiences developing new strategies organically and merging smaller entities into a large company, Peter developed a keen focus on the underlying organizational culture challenges that growth engenders in innovation-driven enterprises. Peter was educated at Stanford University and Northwestern University, where he obtained his Kellogg MBA, Marketing and Information Management, and the USC Marshall School of Business Center for Effective Organizations. Peter is co-founder and COO of the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Ed and Peter, for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Happy to be here.
Very happy to be here.
Well, let's dive in. And I want to start with one of the most important books about culture. And it's the third edition that you released of the Corporate Culture Survival Guide, Culture Change Leadership. And that was released in July 2019. And Ed, what I understand is that you consider this the best and the most comprehensive culture book to date, as it takes a very comprehensive look at how culture, change, and leadership are bound together. And they're bound together in a wave-like process of continuous evolution, as you call it. So I really want to ask you, could you share more about this evolution of your thought and research process and experience around the concept of corporate culture?
I think it's a great question because I do think both in my own work and in the work with Peter, we have begun to see that what started out to just be the study of organizational cultures way back in the 80s, I would discover that an American computer company that was very successful and a chemical company in Europe that was very successful both attributed their success partly to their culture, but their cultures were about as different as you could imagine,
Yeah.
both in terms of who they were and where they were. And so I began to realize that there is no perfect culture, that culture is an evolving property of organizations. It plays a different role at different times in the growth of that organization. And the more the world evolved, becoming more international, more multi occupational, I began to see that the word culture applied not just to these organizations, but
Mm-hmm.
very usefully applied to the countries in which they worked, to the occupations that were doing it. A hospital and a business organization are both organizations, but they're run by entirely different kinds of occupations. And finally, that from what used to be just a descriptive concept of what is our culture,
Yeah.
we now all want to know, how do we create a culture? How do we change a culture? And that immediately forces us to look at everything we know about leadership. So the important thing in this last edition of the Corporate Culture Survival Guide is that culture, leadership, and change have become sort of one unit of thinking and working, both research and application. That's really the shift I have experienced.
And
Thank
I would
you.
just add a comment that one thing that we've both seen together in the 4 years that we've been working together
Mm-hmm.
is that the interest and the number of companies that are talking about culture on their own, about their own culture, or the number of companies that are talking about helping others analyze and ultimately sort of change and evolve their cultures it's dramatic. It's significant.
Yeah.
There are in the fifth edition of the Organizational Culture and Leadership textbook,
Mm-hmm.
put a section in on some startups that were doing software as a service based culture analysis. And that was 3 or 4 years ago. And the number of like companies that are doing similar things to help other organizations sort out their culture
Yeah.
is, up and to the right of where we were 4 years ago. So it's a hot topic, but we're also feeling like it's a hot topic that still needs to be grounded in theory and some discipline in studying it, so that we don't just do a 3-question survey and analyze the results over the course of a week and say that
Yeah.
we understand our culture. It's just it's a little more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for this introduction. And so, um, when I summarize this, this is about the evolution has to do with discovering that culture is not just in one context or one concept or one realm, but it's in multiple realms, and it's all interacting and all determining um, people's behavior and leadership and the place that they work in, and their professions equally contribute to that when looking at culture as maybe their organizational culture does or their country culture does. And also what I hear is that it's a concept that has evolved. It really has become a hot topic in a business context, especially also in places where you wouldn't really expect it to grow as well, such as in the software as a service type of area. So it needs more grounding. It needs to have a foundation in theory. And um, what I notice is in the context of the summit with other speakers, we also talk about culture and not just as a concept, but also as the hot topic that it has become. And what I notice is that some of them are naming what they call myths around culture. And what, for example, they say, they feel that many companies approach culture as something that you can change by just creating a set of organizational values and sticking them to the wall, or that it can be created, and that it doesn't emerge, and that that's also a myth. Or the popular saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And some speakers say, well, actually, there's something that eats culture again, like structure or purpose. So, which of these myths are you familiar with, and do you agree or disagree with when we're talking about the edgy sides of the concept of culture?
I just want to first say that I would guess that there's none of these myths that Ed isn't familiar with. Looking at this for
Yeah.
a long time, and so
Mhm.
it's with quite a lot of interest and quite a bit of entertainment that we come across a new myth now and again.
Yeah.
So that Ed,
Well, we have known for a long time that any group or organization that has any history develops something that is common to everyone.
Hmm.
And the value of the word culture is that it's an attempt to capture this joint learning that a group or an organization has gone through in its own evolution.
Yeah.
And one of the worst myths is to link culture to something simple like a typology.
Yeah.
We're an outward looking culture or an inward looking culture, because that may be accurate, but it may be dealing with 1/100th of what that whole culture actually is. And the trouble with those myths is when we try to change something, we have to understand the complexity of which parts of all the parts of culture matter to where the organization is trying to get.
Right.
And those myths that deal with just power or just inward outward, or are we a market or a clan, they presume that that variable is the important one in the making of the changes that they're trying to do in order to get better at something.
Yeah.
So my way of dealing with that is to say, well, figure out where you're trying to get better in the first place, and don't use the word culture in defining it. A better culture is about the silliest phrase you could use, because it says nothing, because culture is so many things.
Yeah.
Figure out how you want to get better, and then instead of looking for one of these many ways to collapse it into a single variable, study what's going on in the history of that organization that has created who you are,
Hmm.
and that will function as possibly a help in getting to what's going to be better, or maybe a source of huge resistance. A company that's always been rigidly bureaucratic can announce all they want to how they're going to become team-based tomorrow, but it won't happen, because everything they've learned up to that point says that the way to do things is to look up the rule and work by the rule, and don't get caught up in irrelevant things, or they'll even have a team management program, and the employees will say, well, here we go with the program of the month program,
Yeah.
and we go through it dutifully, but it has nothing to do with our actual daily work. We're going to continue to do what we've always learned to do, because that made us successful.
Yeah.
So rather than knocking myths aside, I prefer the other approach of starting with culture is a complex concept, and that is its value. It
Yeah.
captures everything that the group has learned, including how the group strategizes, including even the structure. The structure is, in fact, one of the most powerful elements of the culture. So anyone who says structure eats culture for breakfast, they just don't know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, that may be overkill, but I think figure out your problem first and then examine all the elements of culture to see which ones will help you and which ones will hinder you.
Yeah.
One of the things that we try to do in the new book is make clear and quite explicit the distinctions between the deep underlying assumptions that really represent sort of the DNA of the culture,
Mm-hmm.
juxtaposed to the espoused values or what people say is important. So you may have that poster on the wall in the break room or the kitchen
Yeah.
that talks about, our values are for the year 2020, but because you just went through a reformulation process. But if those things are distinct from the underlying assumptions that came, from the founder and evolved through the history of the company, you're still going to have those sort of gaps in what people who work at that company sort of perceive and believe about what it means to work there. Similarly, we talk about the distinctions between technical culture, which are, how we compete, how we think about our markets, how
Mm-hmm.
we formulate strategy, from social culture, which is how we interact, how we, believe we should behave toward each other. So the sort of classic distinction might be that we talk about in our technical culture how we're going to institute new systems to be more collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
But if our founders and our history suggests that we are much more comfortable and much more naturally sort of contentious or competitive with each other, we can say all we want, that we want to be collaborative. But if our nature as an organization is to be contentious and competitive with each other, it's not going to change with a poster on the break room wall.
No,
So
no,
thinking about
exactly.
multidimensionality, and anytime we're studying culture, to try to make sure that we're understanding at all of the different levels.
Yeah, yeah. And so what I get from how you phrased it just now is that culture is a complex thing, and we can use it for the benefit of moving forward with our organizations if we see it as such, both containing the DNA and the history, being multi-layered and multidimensional, and it doesn't help us if we treat it as something that is linear and flat, and that can be changed by emphasizing certain very small areas of it, and not taking into account the much bigger complex thing it actually is.
Yeah, I
So,
think you used a very important word there, which was linear. That
mm,
it's not, and we don't think of anything in that linear sense. A
no,
linear culture change program is sort of a nonsensical concept. It has to be an iterative, cyclical, wave-like is the other word that we've used to
mhm,
describe how culture change and leadership are related to each other.
yeah,
Thinking of it as linear change programs is, I mean, you may change some things, but the real deep process of culture change is iterative and systemic and wave-like, not linear.
yeah, yeah. And so, as we were talking, and it's such a delight to talk to both of you. And I'm really curious, in the introduction, um, what we notice is that there's a sort of pivot point where you started to work together, or started to work more closely together. And what was the onset for you to start doing that? related to culture and change and leadership. And how did your work experiences that started from different angles come together, and how did your work relationship evolve from that?
Well, I'll just take first stab that when Ed was writing the first organizational culture and leadership book,
Mm-hmm.
I was an undergrad studying social anthropology at Stanford.
Yeah.
So, and that's a long time ago. And so it's sort of always been the family business. My older sister is also a social anthropologist. So we sort of joke about it. It took me, 30 plus years to finally get around to joining the business. But it also was, Ed moved out here to where I live in Silicon Valley a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave us a chance to spend a lot more time just kind of talking about our work lives and starting to kind of share stories and rediscover what was really important for the two of us.
Yeah.
And I kind of was at a pivot point for myself in my own career. And this was, the chance of a lifetime to get together and work with my dad. So that's what started the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute at the end of 2015. And we've been doing it since then and consulting and writing books. And so that's the origin story.
Yeah.
From my point of view, what happened is when I came out here about 8-9 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I was glad to be done teaching, but I wasn't happy not to be writing. Writing was really what I wanted to do more of.
Yeah.
So I just kept going, wrote Humble Inquiry, I wrote the book Helping, and was plugging along when about, 4.5 years ago, in walks Peter and says, why don't we work together and co-author something together?
Yeah.
And that just opened up my world to something that I hadn't planned on, but that was truly a magnificent pivot for me, because one thing I knew is that Silicon Valley has always been viewed as a very interesting, curious mix of cultures and whatevers. And so suddenly I had, from an information point of view,
Mm-hmm.
access to everything Peter knew from 35 years of working out here and being interested. So it added a huge research base
Yeah.
to what I had brought with me. But then a lot of people ask us, how does this father-son thing work? And I was very happy to discover that it worked very easily, that mostly what Peter wanted to bring to the party
Mm-hmm.
is stuff that I needed and wanted. And so from the beginning, we didn't in any way overlap. We had like separate domains to talk about and build common theory. And so rather than either of us having to change much, I think we kind of found a common direction
Yeah.
that led to the Humble Leadership book.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really want to ask you about that book, because why humble leadership? I know that that there's at some point you found the overlap of, oh, what is it that we can uh, co-research and co-author when we bring our experience together. But why specifically humble leadership?
Well, there's an interesting side story to that. When I first came out here, the book I really wanted to work on was the book that ended up being called Helping,
Mm-hmm.
because my personality as a process consultant, I always wanted to be helpful. In that book, the next to last chapter is called Humble Inquiry. And
Yeah.
the publisher said, "You've got to write a book by that title." I said, "No way, I'm done with that. I liked the helping book, I was finished." And I didn't do anything for well over a year until I found myself experiencing suddenly that I was very busy telling people stuff and being the expert, and discovering that when people did that to me, I hated it. But suddenly I realized, okay, now I can write the book Humble Inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And so the word humble appeared at that point. And then I had to figure out, well, what is humble all about? And by then, Peter and I are talking, and we realize that that's the missing element in so much leadership theory. That
Yeah.
leadership is tell, 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 rather than ask and inquire. So from humble inquiry, then there was a little sidelight where I wrote humble consulting, because I was angry that the publisher didn't let me republish Process Consultation. There's a different publisher now. But all these forces together put the focus on the word humble.
Yeah.
And we then realized that humble leadership is a crucial topic that has to be explored in depth. That's my end of how we got to humble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then the only thing I would add to that is that Ed's focus on process takes us to the title, which is that leadership as a process, not, so we hesitate to use the term humble leader,
Right.
because
Mm-hmm.
that suggests something different, but humble leadership being a process that can happen anywhere in an organization, where we define leadership as doing something new and better, not some much more complicated sort of mythical, myth of the great leader or the great, iconic charismatic leader. We're talking about leadership as a process that's relatively simple, organic, magical, but it happens anywhere in an organization. And so that's part of what we're getting at with humble leadership, is that acceptance that, part of a challenge for a modern organization is to let leadership happen anywhere in the organization. Don't assume it has to be the head of this or the head of that. Great ideas come from all over the place in an organization. And humble leadership is about drawing out and sharing information in order to capture that innovation.
And we learn by looking carefully at history and our own experience that the great charismatic leaders exhibit a great deal of humble leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So our cases are deliberately geared to military leaders, to Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, to a hospital CEO. These are great leaders, but what they did to accomplish their goals was to exhibit wonderful cases of humble leadership.
Yeah, yeah. And I couldn't underline more leadership as a process that can happen anywhere in an organization. And sometimes when looking at just to compare or just to put next to it, when I look at systemic leadership, I have a similar tendency to not say anything about a leader per se, because that sort of draws us back into a paradigm that we've had for so long, where it's all about the individual leader and not about leadership as a process that can be shaped or takes shape within the context of an organization or even a bigger living human system. And yeah, so thank you for adding that. And I would like to explore the humble a little more, because what I heard you say is it can happen anywhere in the organization. Anyone can do this. Um, and also, it is away from the charismatic. But why specifically humble? Because there's also, for example, servant leadership or other types of leadership that are more in that realm. So, why did you choose specifically the word um, humble?
Because you use the word systemic. Uh, when you think about the tasks that leaders face today,
Mm-hmm.
the word humble applies primarily to what we're calling here and now humility in the face of the task that I or we as a group are facing. I might be an arrogant SOB, but I may find myself in a situation where I just don't know enough to make a decision.
Yeah.
At that point, I better know how to be here and now humble. If
Right.
I don't have that capacity to be situationally, systemically humble, I'm going to fail. So it's very important to treat the word humble as a situational property
Yeah.
of an individual, the capability to be humble, rather than as a trait or as a personality characteristic of all these other fancy uses of the word.
Yeah.
It's a problem-solving situational capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, especially what appeals to me and what you just said is, and what ties it to the systemic for me also, is that the old idea of having to know it all as a leader versus being in the here and now, where you're sitting in complexity and you don't have all the answers. And um, so the humility you then need to be able to tap into um, may be so much more door opening to um, a next step or a next move or a next evolution of things, rather than trying to pin down the context into something flat that you can understand and then control.
I
So,
think it's very important not to make the mistake that humility means you flatten the organization.
mm-hmm,
Hierarchy is still there, the roles are still there,
mm-hmm,
accountabilities are still there,
yeah,
but the captain of the ship is still a captain, can say to people, what do you see going on?
yeah,
Explain it to me. I'm
yeah.
still a captain, but I can be humble at that moment and say, I need your input or we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's important also the context where we started writing this is that we were both very interested in things like self-managed teams and holacracy.
Mhm.
And you're familiar with that concept.
Yeah, we've had Brian Robertson also on the
Okay, yeah.
summit.
So
Yeah.
so that's really good stuff. It's really important, but it's not going to work for every organization.
No.
Um, and then at the same time, the Frederick Laloux Reinventing Organizations book, um, sort of creates this archetype of a teal organization.
Mhm.
Um, we were trying to sort of capture some of those ideas, but put it in a sort of a smaller group context. That if groups behaved with this attitude of there's good ideas everywhere. I'm going to go in with to every workday with the humility that I don't have the answers,
Mhm.
but the group probably does. Um, let's think of that as a way we're going to move forward rather than some sort of static, um, you know, uh, uh, linear decision model, because we
Yeah.
don't think that's the way humans are actually wired. We think that's the way
Mm-hmm.
machines operate.
Yeah.
And yes, machines created by humans, but we're trying to tilt the balance back, to let's let groups figure out how to do things, because the ideas are as much in the group as they are in the head of the designated leader. So I guess all by way of saying this kind of came out of the same zeitgeist as the Teal organization or Holacracy.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of really important ideas out there, around this sort of reinserting the human at the center of the organization, and recognizing that our, production models, our machine models, might have worked in the 1950s when we were building cars, but do they really work today in markets that are more complex, they're more volatile, they're more uncertain, they're more ambiguous? We use that VUCA term,
Mm-hmm. The VUCA term. Yeah.
because it kind of captures the complexity that organizations are really facing today. So it was humble leadership was our attempt at assimilating all of these different ideas with some new stories and a focus on groups and relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you mentioned relationships, I would that's a space where I would like to go next, because from my understanding, you distinguish different levels of relationship, and place humble leadership on that sort of continuum. Could you speak more to that, about how you look at relationships, maybe in an organizational context?
Okay, I'll take that. So this is Ed's model that first, I think, was first published in the Humble Consulting book.
Hmm.
It's Ed's sort of synthesis over, going back to probably the 1950s, and the sort of early group dynamics research. But it's a way to think about our continuum of relationships, which, by the way, we appreciate that you are thinking of it in those terms, because a more static model of relationships is it's not realistic. We all know that, as human beings, we probably have thousands of unique relationships.
Hmm.
However, there is some way that we can categorize them. So our four layers are we call it, we have a level -1, which is -1 because it is a relationship, but it's a negative relationship. It's a domination and submission relationship, and those exist in factories. They exist in all sorts of different workforces, but they're not a stable and sustainable model for, for leadership and followership. They're a contentious and a tense model.
Hmm.
So level 1 is what we refer to as sort of a transactional model that, is very common in organizations, and in many cases it may be the right design for a relationship, given, depending on what the task, of that group is. So it's transactional, and it's based on it's based on known role to role relationships that are characterized by essentially handing off or transacting business between the two roles.
Right.
And again, that's common, and it may be a very productive way, it may be a very efficient way to get work done.
Hmm.
But we want to contrast that with what we call our level 2 relationship, which is based on a whole person to whole person connection, where the key is about sharing information, all information, not just the information that's helpful to one role, versus another, but a way that two whole human beings are sharing information in order to kind of move outside of the roles
Yeah.
and get more done.
Yeah.
So another way to characterize the difference would be transactional relationships may be very effective, or we call our level 1 relationships, may be very efficient, excuse me, whereas level 2 relationships, what we call our our person-to-person relationships are
Mm-hmm.
more effective
Yeah.
because more information is shared. Then
Yeah.
the other level of the model is level 3, which is intimacy, where you're so close that you can finish each other's sentences. And
Mm-hmm.
generally, intimacy may not be quite right or quite acceptable given the rules in the workplace. But we also have a lot of conversations with people that are very interested in the idea of professional intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
where you are very close and you spend 12 hours a day together. You really know each other quite well. You could call it an intimate relationship, but it isn't a romantic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the 4-level model. And maybe, Ed, if you want to kind of place humble leadership within that model.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first place I encountered this, by the way, was when I was teaching Sloan Fellows over the years. That was my major teaching. They were all high potential engineers becoming managers. And one of the puzzles always was uh, how do you get to talk to the unionized guys in the shop?
Yeah.
It was always a big puzzle. And there was always a percentage, sometimes 10, sometimes 20% of managers who said, it's funny, I don't have that problem. And we got very curious, what is it about these managers that they talk to the unionized guys and they feel buddy-buddy and they seem to get jobs done better? And the answer usually was, I really know my people. I know my people.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? It means they were curious. They tried to form what we're now calling a level 2 relationship from the beginning.
Yeah.
It never occurred to them to maintain professional distance. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the key difference. Level 1 is very formal, professionally distant, don't fraternize. Level 2 is we got to get to know each other in order to build enough trust.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to have any problems on the floor, and I'm not going to have hostile subordinates because we've built these level 2 relationships. And that seems to be the essence and the necessity to be a humble leader. I don't
Yeah.
see how you can be a humble leader if you start with, I'm in my role, I'm the boss, that gives me the right to tell you what to do. And then the day I need information, you're going to have no incentive to give it to me because I've created the distance.
Yeah.
So humble leadership kind of intrinsically implies level 2, more personal relationships.
And
Right.
just to add one other thing, that Ed brought the idea of asking a question of somebody who works for you.
Mm-hmm.
We got onto this idea that a leader can always ask a question and get an answer, but the question is, when are you going to get an answer to a question you don't ask? Right? When is there some information that exists in that team? Somebody picked something up, somebody learned something that turns out is relevant, but if they don't have that openness and trust to share that information,
Yeah.
and the boss doesn't have the curiosity to ask what's going on, then that information gets lost, and some other innovative company ends up, first to the market with something
Yeah.
because somebody knew something and they didn't have the group didn't have the trust and openness to say it. And one of the things that we talk a lot about these days, and is a great area of interest for Ed, is in the safety and accident literature. And so that example of somebody knows something and they don't have the psychological safety to speak up is a case where it's they're not in a humble leadership context. They're in a level 1 professionally distant role to role
Yeah.
context, and information doesn't get shared, and then an accident happens and we have to sort of do the root cause analysis and discover that people knew there was information out there
Yeah.
that might have prevented the accident, but they didn't have the level 2 relationship or the psychological safety to actually volunteer the information.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
would relinquish the information if asked. But when can we count on information to be shared, even without the head of the group asking for it? That's
Yeah.
what we're trying to get at with humble leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what you're actually saying and thank you so much for this explanation, because what clicks for me is that um, the more information that is inside an organization or a living human system, and the more it can flow freely, the more you can tap its potential for the organization to grow or to move towards its purpose more. And so what I hear you say is that humble leadership facilitates the process of getting to a higher level um, of relationship, in the sense that it's more personal, that creates the trust and the possibility for the information to flow freely. And so what I do find very intriguing, and in this summit, we regularly also talk about role. And in some systemic approaches, it's important to distinguish between the personal and the role, because there's a lot of mix-up when there's the collapse of the personal and the role, because people start to use their roles for personal gain that doesn't necessarily support what the organization wants. And as we're discussing humble leadership, what I hear you say is, but if we're too much stuck on our roles, especially the hierarchical ones, from a leadership perspective, and we do not bring in the personal, how we're going to create the safety and the trust that we need for the information to flow.
You
So,
said that you heard us saying that it might be desirable to go to level 2 personal relationships. I feel more strongly about that. In a systemic organization dealing with complex problems, unless you go to a level 2 relationship, there is no way you're going to capture all the information that's going on in the system.
yeah.
Because and there is nothing in the idea of personizing a relationship that suggests that the role goes away. Whoever advocated that? No way are we saying the role goes away.
No.
As the role is built into the structure.
Yeah.
But how you play the role is entirely your choice. We've known that forever. You write the perfect job description and you put 3 different people in it and they do it 3 different ways.
Yeah, exactly.
The notion that the role in some ways restricts you is an alternate terrible theory that should be abandoned quickly. The role sets some limits and some accountabilities, but it leaves you huge freedom to get not only more personal with your people, but even more important, we haven't used the word listening enough. It's not just enough for the subordinate to speak up. It's even more important almost for the superior in that hierarchy to hear what the subordinate is actually saying. So the level 2 humble leader is both a good inquirer and a very good listener, but they do stay in their roles.
Yeah.
Except where the task itself says we got to shift roles. Then they need the flexibility to do that in the system.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're explaining this, what I notice is that for the lack of a better word, to me, it sounds like this requires a lot of maturity of people, because not everyone is inclined or able or willing to go to a level 2 type of uh, relationship within their organization, or find it difficult to go the more personal route, while holding their roles. Because there's also circumstances where people let go of the role, and there's some circumstances where people are completely consumed by their role, and even forget that they are dealing with humans in their organizations. So could you speak to that process more? Because I can understand that many leaders were trained, as we talked about a little earlier in this conversation, they were trained to treat their organizations and everyone in it like machines. And what does it actually take then to move towards a humble leadership more? What are the things that you see that can be done when there's leaders who are very come from that more traditional type of paradigm?
Well, unfortunately, even though leadership can occur anywhere in the organization,
Mm-hmm.
if the top of the organization doesn't get it or is very level 1 committed,
Yeah.
sooner or later there's going to be dysfunction somewhere down in the system.
Yeah.
So you do have to face the possibility that level 2 has to just not be an occasional person here and there exhibiting that behavior, but that there has to be at the top a recognition and a desire to have a more open and trusting organization. Not necessarily to commit to the label level 2, but if
Mm-hmm.
you're committed, if you're a nuclear plant and you're committed to total safety, and you realize that that requires trust throughout the organization,
Mm-hmm.
that has to start at the top.
Mm-hmm.
The board members don't treat their CEO that way, or if the CEO doesn't treat his or her direct reports that way, sooner or later it's going to erode and not happen. So where the task really is crucial for trust and openness, there has to be at the minimum support of, and preferably advocacy of, and behavior that is level 2 at the very top of the organization.
Mm.
I don't think we can get around that.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, the good news is that if it really spreads in the middle or in a project, sometimes that's a wake-up call to the top.
Yeah.
If you've got a good, broad executive level 1 type at the top who sees all these good things happening, that person might say, whoa, maybe I haven't learned everything there is to know about how to run this organization.
Yeah.
It's possible, I think, to influence upward.
And this is in some respects, you could look at the Google Project Aristotle. I don't know if you're familiar with that research, but they did a very deep study a few years back about what made some of their engineering teams more successful than others.
Yeah.
And they thought, that they know how to analyze stuff at Google, and they thought that they would find some project management approaches, or some, as we would call technical culture approaches that some teams were able to effectuate, others weren't.
Yeah.
And in the end, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying it here, but what they found is that the teams that were most successful had that highest sense of psychological safety
Yeah.
to really communicate with each other what was going on. And so the regardless of what the task was, the implication was, and also regardless of where they were in the organization, the implication was that those groups were just performing better because they were sharing information better.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to raise that we were starting to get at as part of this distinction,
Mm-hmm.
um, Ed will grimace when I bring it up yet again, but I've had this issue with the concept of transparency
Yeah.
because we push so hard how important transparency is. And I tend to view transparency more as this rule that gets imposed from the top,
Yeah.
where we agree that you will share that information. We'll set out a bunch of metrics. We'll set out a sort of a dashboard, and our value of transparency will populate all the information into that dashboard. We share it, and we're transparent. But that's transparency as a rule or as a weapon.
Yeah.
What we like to think of as openness and sharing of information as an opportunity or as a value. So it's not transparency that we want, it's openness to
Yeah.
share information that might be useful. And I'm sharing it because it might be useful, not because I'm required to share it because we have a transparent system. A
Yeah.
transparent system gets you so far. An open system gets you places you might not have known you were going.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for that distinction, because there's, as soon as transparency becomes a rule, then it lowers trust levels and sense of safety, because you may be sitting on a piece of information that may be tied to you in a negative way or have certain consequences that you are not able or not willing to carry on behalf of the entire organization. But if there's a space of trust and there's space of openness, then it's actually no longer important who is giving the information or who is sharing the information, because there's more of a free flow, and as if the information emerges and flows through the system rather than it's pockets of knowledge that people sit on and decide whether they do or do not want to share the information.
Right.
And so so we've been talking about up until this point, we've been talking about culture and how that evolved. We've been talking about your collaboration, and we've been talking about humble leadership and unpacking humble leadership and how it sits when we look at openness and free flowing of information and relationship levels. And in the beginning, we said that there is this that culture, leadership, and change are together. And so I would like to move into the change area, so you will. And how does how do you shape change with your organization from a place of humble leadership then?
Well, I think the first point is to separate the words change and culture.
Mm-hmm.
Change certainly is something that you need if you're in a dynamic environment.
Yeah.
There's pretty much broad agreement that the static company today, unless they're in a very unusual static industry, companies have to learn how to be more agile and how to grow and change in various ways. But the minute they say we're changing our culture, they've already blown it. You have to say, no, you're changing something in your strategy or your customer base, or you're something that really is the survival issue for the organization.
Yeah.
Culture may or may not be the survival issue. It's whether you're producing products at a certain cost that's and certain profit level that's the survival issue. So change is about identifying what's our problem. What do we need to do differently tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, you realize that doing something different is what leadership is all about. Leadership should be defined as the process of managing change for something new and better.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than calling management leadership, management should be keeping the status quo working effectively.
Yeah.
Leadership is managing change, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so leadership, in that sense, you can say, will a level 1 leader be a successful change agent? And I think no, because in a complex world, they won't get the information they need to implement the changes that are going to be better for the organization. So it leads to the awkward but necessary conclusion that an effective leader in a changing world better learn how to be a level 2 leadership type individual
Mm-hmm.
who can build the trust to get the information to implement the right things. Because the other part of that is that even if an individual who's very bright has the right answer, consulting companies are full of them. They'll tell you exactly what the right answer is.
Yeah.
They realize that the real problem of implementation is to understand the culture, because the culture is what surfaces both what will help you and what will hinder you. So to implement change also requires level 2 relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
It ends up that you can't really, in today's world, do anything if you're not headed toward improving relationships from level 1 to level 2.
Mm.
And just to add, the other point that we, started with really is that it is a continuous iterative wave-like process. Intrinsic in humble leadership is an acknowledgement that with a change program, some things are going to work and some things aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And that so long as we're continuing to make progress on improvement, even if we didn't meet all of our improvement goals, we have to recognize that improvement process, changing the contours of the organization iteratively, is still positive. We should think of it as there's no such thing as a failed improvement project,
Mm-hmm.
because we have managed to change some things, and some things remain to be changed. On to the next project. We continue to do it. We just continue to cycle. And part of it too, Ed talks a lot about in the sort of the original change theory about survival anxiety and learning anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And if we learn together as an organization how to routinize change, to continue to just make a improvement as a process of daily work, then the learning anxiety idea becomes less salient, because we know that it's not, oh, I have to unlearn A and relearn B.
Mm-hmm.
I know every day that I'm continually adapting from A to B, or from A to C, or A to Z. It's
Mm-hmm.
a continuous iterative process.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I summarize this, what I heard you say is that it's important to not collapse culture and change, and that culture is in a continuous process, and the continued adaptation of the organization towards what's coming from the outside, and in terms of how can we improve and move towards our purpose, as I put it in my words. And that leadership has to do with facilitating that process, in the sense that if you transition from level 1 to level 2, then your chances of having a strong continued change process are much higher than when you try to do this from a level 1 or even a different level, again, in your organization.
I would put it stronger than that. If you stay at level 1,
Mm-hmm.
today's world, many companies will be in difficulty because the world is changing so rapidly around
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that's a whole separate topic, but we talk about automation and the perceived threat of AI.
Mm-hmm.
One of the arguments that we like to make is that functions in organizations or functions in sectors of the economy that tend to be more level 1 and transactional,
Yeah.
are the ones that are most prone to be disrupted by automation or AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the adaptive, interpretive, all of the things that human beings are good at is going to be valued in contexts where level 2 is the right way to approach things, and not so much in the transactional model, where it really is just about sort of linear decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Innovation doesn't happen in places where linear decision making thrives.
No. So actually, as we're talking here about humble leadership, about change as a continued process, and that's what leadership is about, in terms of facilitating that process and further enabling that process in your organization, and understanding that comes from a level 2 relationship building, that's sort of the core at how you look at what facilitates change the best, and how that's tied to humble leadership.
You earlier asked, how is it different from these other, like servant leadership?
Yeah.
All these other models of leadership
Mm-hmm.
define leadership in terms of who the follower should be, for example.
Yeah.
Oh, and we're talking about leadership, which supersedes all of them or underlies all of them.
Mm-hmm.
A servant leader also has to be a level 2 leader.
Yeah.
A transformational leader also has to be a level 2 leader. So we're not distinguishing it as a type of leader type, but as a process that all types of leaders need to learn how to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think just the other historical point on that is that this really may be a much more natural way for people to think about working and evolving in organizations, progressing careers.
Yeah.
And what may be far less natural is what we did when we started, automating in the middle of the last century, where we created these static sort of machine models of organizations that made sense when you were building cars.
Yeah.
But we're not. We know how to build cars, and most of it's done by robots. So it's more how are we going to sort of innovate around some of these really vexing, complex problems that organizations tend to be facing today. Yeah. And at the end of the day, what we're talking about is level 2 relationship building is very natural. Humans do it every day. We know how to build relationships. We know how to build friendships. And part of what we're trying to say is it's okay to do that at work.
Yeah.
that there we're well aware that there are some real tricky boundaries and real sort of lines that can't be crossed, but generally human beings are pretty good at figuring that stuff out. We do
Yeah.
it, most of our waking hours. So
Yeah.
the sort of rehumanizing organizations, that's kind of how we interpret that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Ann and Peter, we've almost come to the end of our conversation, and I have one more question for you for now. And that is, how did writing and studying and talking about humble leadership and working with it influence your leadership in your life?
Well, I mean, I guess part of, for me, what drew me to this way of thinking, to this mindset, to ultimately to this book,
Mm-hmm.
was that I found myself in much of my career in Silicon Valley being in management and leadership positions where I had no formal authority.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't impose a direction or ask a question, or I had to draw things out of people because I was in parts of the organization that were all entirely matrixed.
Yeah.
So I needed to figure out a way to move the ball forward, get an initiative going, get a deal done. Again, without any formal authority. So I think a lot of this idea, and in conversation with Ed, it was easier for me to sort of formalize what I had been experiencing, trying to lead inorganic growth initiatives in a large organization,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of putting a theoretical frame around something that I had been experiencing. I think when we go out and talk to people in organizations around here in Silicon Valley, we sense that there's that natural affinity that, yeah, this is the kind of stuff I do every day.
Yeah.
I just hadn't really thought about it in those terms.
Yeah.
So that's how it connects for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And how is that for you, Ed?
Well, for me, it's a matter of remembering what I learned in the first place. Because I learned early on as a consultant how useless it was to figure things out and tell the client what to do. So this whole idea of learning how to be helpful in the process of helping clients make changes became part of my consulting style. And I think sometimes it's not at all my natural style. That if I think I know where we're going, I much prefer to tell. But writing about it is like professionally reminding myself, you've got to practice what you preach. And that the natural impulse to be on top of things and have it all go smoothly and tell everybody what to do, just remind myself over and over again, it won't work. People will find a way to sabotage it. And so to me, the learning process from working with Peter, doing these things, writing about it, is a perpetual reminder that this is not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy to be an inquirer and to let information come to you and to really listen to people. The listening is the most important new skill that I think I've learned over the many years. Is I am a better listener today than I was. And that keeps me from doing dumb things.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure that everybody who's been watching and listening found it incredibly intriguing to to witness this session. I would like to thank you both, Ed and Peter, for being here and for sharing so freely about culture, humble leadership, and change. Thank you so much for being on.
It's been a pleasure to have a chance to talk about it.
Great questions, great dialogue.
And to everyone who's been watching, thank you so much for tuning in. If you wish to continue the conversation about the level of leadership that you find yourself shaping in your organization, or if you want to look more into your own humble leadership and talk about it more, then please go to our online community space. I look forward to meeting you there. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.